Welcome to Scigest, your fortnightly science from the Bioeconomy Science Institute. Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to Scigest. I'm your host, Hilary Island. In the spring of 1985, a pivotal breeding cross produced two of New Zealand's most successful apple varieties, Scifresh and Scilate, later commercialised and marketed by T&G Global as Jazz and Envy apples. Fast forward to today, and T&G Global's Jazz and Envy apples are exported to over 55 countries, with Envy well on its way to becoming a billion-dollar brand. Together, Jazz and Envy set new standards for flavour, texture and quality on the global market. In this special two-part series, we celebrate the 40-year anniversary of two world-class cultivars. First, we explore the history, breeding process and key factors contributing to the industry transformation. Then, we investigate the commercialisation journey which established Jazz and Envy as successful brands. Joining us to dive into the science behind the success story is scientist and apple breeder in the Plant and Food Research Group of the Bioeconomy Science Institute, Richard Volz. Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here, Hilary.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Before we delve into the success story, can you tell us about your role in the Plant and Food Research Group?
Yeah, so from 2001, I was the apple breeder for Plant and Food Research, and I relinquished that role last year. So now I am the apple and pear breeding advisor, whereby I assist a number of apple and pear breeders we have working in the team in their breeding work.
Wonderful. So how many years is that? 24, 23 years?
Yeah, it's quite a few years of working in apple and pear breeding. So yeah, learned a lot. Still learning, actually, even this late stage in my career, always learning.
So as mentioned in the introduction, today we celebrate the 40-year anniversary of apple cultivars Scifresh, also known as Jazz, and Scilate, also known as Envy. Can you tell us about who was involved in this game-changing moment 40 years ago?
Yeah, well, the key person involved was the then apple breeder Alan White, who had recently been appointed as the first full-time permanent apple and pear breeder for then DSIR to become Hawke Research and then Plant and Food Research. And he basically was it in the mid-1980s. There were a few casual staff when required for tasks that involve quite a lot of work, but yeah, Alan was it. Obviously a lot of people involved with the development of those two cultivars over the next 10, 20 years, but yep, Alan was it.
Was DSIR performing breeding functions in other crops at the time?
Yeah, there was certainly a number of crops, annual crops, potato, onion, but also we were talking about the kiwi fruit breeding program is just at the very early stages. So we had a little bit of breeding around stone fruit, summer fruit, peaches and nectarines, but generally speaking, plant breeding was at its infancy in terms of DSIR.
So back in 1985, there were a few cultivars, but there were four main cultivars dominating apple exports in New Zealand. They were Braeburn, Royal Gala, Red Delicious and Granny Smith. So given the popularity of Braeburn and Royal Gala back then, they were the parents, as mentioned in the introduction, of the successful cross that produced Scifresh and Scilate. So with Braeburn and Royal Gala being so popular, was a cross between these two parents considered groundbreaking or unusual?
Well, they certainly were, if we take around the world, because Braeburn and Royal Gala were very much New Zealand varieties, very successful varieties for the New Zealand industry at the time. But they weren't really known much outside New Zealand back then, certainly in terms of potential breeding parents. So the choice Alan made to use those as two parents was quite novel in the scheme of things. But if you think about it, quite obvious really from a New Zealand perspective, because they were very successful export varieties. And we have to remember that, is that Alan was breeding for the New Zealand industry that was very much export focused. So that means the fruit had to do well some weeks and months after harvest in terms of having a a good eating quality and attractive appearance to our Northern Hemisphere customers. And then I think the other thing, what was interesting about the cross was that Alan put a lot of effort into it. So we had two good parents, but he also realised that he needed a large number of seedlings and thus seed from that cross. So therefore, a lot of resource was put into those crosses in order to select individuals that would be a step up in terms of a potential cultivar, or in this case cultivars, that would have good commercial potential.
If Braeburn and Royal Gala were so popular and good exporters, what was driving the desire to have more and different cultivars?
That's a very good question. The New Zealand industry, even at that time, even though Braeburn and Royal Gala were very successful, New Zealand industry realised that they couldn't stay still. The cost structure for New Zealand, having to ship fruit overseas, means that the cost structure is quite high relative to our Southern Hemisphere competitors like Chile and Argentina, South Africa and so on. One of the ways in which New Zealand could get a competitive edge was to produce something that was better than what was available to those competitors. And at the time, certainly Gala was becoming available to those competitors. So looking ahead, of course, you have to look quite a way ahead when you're dealing with apple breeding. The industry realised that they needed to have something better. And that was really the impetus that drove Alan and DSIR at the time to have an apple breeding program to produce new cultivars.
I see. And so if you could sum up the qualities of Braeburn and Royal Gala in a nutshell, how would you describe them in terms of their fruit qualities, their texture, but also their harvesting time and shipping qualities?
So Gala was actually from a cross made in New Zealand, as I mentioned before, and it had a very good texture at harvest, stored moderately well in terms of texture after several months. It had a very consistent, mostly red stripe appearance. It was a very easy growing apple for growers, easily managed. No storage issues really at all in terms of any disorders, physiological disorders. It returned crop very easily. It was a tad on the small size. That was one of the growing challenges is for the growers to always produce a crop that was allowed for good fruit size. It was a bit of a challenge. As far as Braeburn goes, it was a very heavy yielder of fruit. In contrast to Gala, which was a sweet apple, Braeburn was more acid, appealed particularly to the European and UK consumers. Very high yielding, large fruit size, had quite a dense texture. Stored quite well, but then tended to soften a bit after 3 to 4 months cold air storage. And so each of them had special characteristics, which I think if Alan brought them together in terms of large fruit, attractive, consistent quality, good cropping from a grower perspective, I think could bring together something that took the best out of each of those two cultivars, produced something that was quite good. So that would have been on his mind when he selected those parents. But I don't think he really knew until he saw the seedlings that were produced how revolutionary the two varieties that came out, Scifresh and Scilate, really were relative to the parents.
Right. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? The scope, the number of seedlings involved, the timeline involved in all of this, and the effort really that it took to identify these two unique cultivars from two different crosses as well. So can you give us some insight into that whole journey?
So, as I said before, Alan realised that while he might have two good parents, he really needed to have a large number of seed produced from the crosses. That particular cross, Braeburn Gala, or its reciprocal Gala times Braeburn, there were probably around 20,000 seeds involved that were produced from the crosses, which is a fair large number of seed, and then germinated those seed to produce the seedlings. And so from that time on, as soon as they were into the nursery and into the orchard growing as seedlings on their own roots, they had to be individually identified. And so all the seedlings got codes. And so as they started to produce fruit in the orchard, keeping track of all those seedlings, knowing that some die out because of root issues or disease issues or whatever. So you have to keep track of the individual placement of those seedlings in an appropriate way, and then keep track of the fruit as they go into their bags or their lots into the cool storage. You have to keep track of everything, so you have to keep track of the packages of fruit relating to the plants where they were in the orchard. And so there's a lot of mapping that goes on in all sorts of breeding, but in apple breeding in particular, to make sure you know what sample of fruit is taken from what tree and so on. So there's a lot involved around that process.
Yes, it sounds like it. And these days there's a lot of testing that's done before you get to that final fruit quality trait that you're really truly interested in. For instance, checking for disease susceptibility of seedlings before they're even producing fruit, checking for markers of other traits of interest that aren't necessarily related to fruit quality. So was all of that going into the process back then, 40 years ago?
No, it wasn't. It was, as I said, we started off by saying that it was the start really of apple breeding. And so really it was all around the crossing, but really understanding the fruit quality traits that were produced from the fruiting seedlings and assessing them in an objective way, but still via breeders essentially, or the people who are tasting the fruit, assessing them and recording those values for the key eating quality traits and appearance traits that you saw when you looked at the package of fruit that from a tree that you'd harvested from earlier on. So not so much objective. And today, of course, it's quite a bit different. We're 40 years, isn't it, since those first crosses. And now there's a lot more work done around fast phenotyping, particularly in the glasshouse, around disease tolerance. When the seedlings are only a few centimetres tall, we start doing that sort of work. We start doing work around genotyping to understand what genes are in certain seedlings, what genes are in potential parents that we might want to choose in our mating design. So there's a lot more of that sort of work, but that's not to diminish the important phenotyping that still goes on around the eating quality trait that we've talked about. Yeah. That still has to go on, and it's a really important part of the breeding process.
Yes, right. So also in terms of the timeline, there was multiple crosses, as you mentioned, starting 40 years ago. Every season since 40 years ago, new crosses, producing all of these seedlings. And so how many years did we have to usually wait on average before you got fruit that was a reliable phenotype for that individual?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned reliable, because that's a critical point. I think the first time we see fruiting in a seedling, particularly back in those days where the trees were planted in the orchard on their own roots. Of course, nowadays, in commercial orchards at the time, and nowadays we're planting seedlings that have been grafted or propagated onto rootstocks. But in those days, they were still being planted on their own roots. And so generally, the first fruit might be seen in the 4th or 5th year after crossing. 5th year, a few more seedlings will start to fruit and so on, even up to 6 years. So, but that's just when we see the first fruit. And essentially what we're doing at that first phase is removing all the selections that have got fatal flaws. They would never make it as a cultivar for all sorts of reasons, whether they be from an appearance perspective or from a storageability and eating quality perspective. So we're removing 97% of the seedlings in that first sweep, that first selection. The best of the remainder get propagated up, and then they go on to rootstocks, and they are replicated in a couple of different regions in Hawke's Bay and Nelson usually. And then we see if the fruit quality characteristics that we saw early on are repeated, and how robust they are over seasons, different regions, as I mentioned before, and even within a trial, how robust those quality characteristics are, because that's a critical point. We grow in a variable environment, and we've got to be confident as breeders that those selections that we do put forward are going to be able to produce consistent qualities over those variable seasons and sites and regions. And so that's a critical part of what we call the stage 2 phase of the breeding process. And that usually lasts for a number of fruiting seasons. But I think looking at the timeline for Scifresh in particular, as soon as the first fruiting season was on, Alan, I think he recognised that, this was something special around Scifresh. The fruit quality, particularly the eating fruit quality, was something very special. He would have got the industry people in very quickly to have a look. And I think at the time, people were pretty excited about what they were seeing in terms of a potential new variety.
Outstanding. So at what point after 1985, we've waited all these years for the sort of juvenile stage and the vegetative stage to be over. We're into reproductive phase, producing reliable fruit. So at what point did Alan identify Scifresh as the standout in terms of the timeline?
Yeah, well, it would have been in that phase 2, I think, when that would have been probably, off the top of my head, around about maybe 8 or 9 years after the crossing. He would have seen fruit from those stage 2 plots. And sometimes things are so outstanding that it's worthwhile to move forward quickly, even though you might have some question marks around it, how robust it is, how consistent it is, because it's so outstanding, so different, that, it's worthwhile to take a risk to move it forward as quickly as possible. So I think with Scifresh, that was certainly the case. And as it turned out, it was quite robust anyway. But by taking the effort to produce more trees after stage 2, we might call it stage 3, pre-commercial phase trials, to move forward on that, get it out into grower orchards on test plots as quickly as possible. I think that's why the Scifresh cultivar was able to move quite quickly into launch phase for this variety. And so
if you could describe then the attributes of Scifresh, did it have the magic combination of all the good things from Gala, Royal Gala, and all the good things from Braeburn that Alan White had hoped to achieve?
I think yes, and that probably applies to Envy as well. I think there are characteristics of Gala and Braeburn that are in each of those. Scifresh tending to be a little bit more acid or balanced, we might say, in terms of sugar-acid ratio. Scilate tending to have a sweeter taste. So I think that's the case, but there's something more than that, and that's sort of quite exciting from a breeding perspective, is that they're both apples that are a step above the two parents in terms of texture. So while, as I mentioned before, with Gala and Braeburn, we have two apples that have good texture at harvest, but tend to soften a little bit during storage, particularly over the sort of 2, 3, 4 month sort of time frame where New Zealand apples are being sold into the Northern Hemisphere markets. But with Scifresh and Scilate, we basically have texture that's able to retain its crunch. Fruit are able to retain their crunch, juicy and crisp, well after harvest, going into that 4, 5, 6 month period, with little need for post-harvest technologies to, if you like, maintain those sorts of textures. So it was really a revolutionary change in terms of texture capability, if you like, or texture characteristics that no one had really ever seen before in the world markets, let alone from New Zealand. So yeah, it was pretty, as I say, pretty revolutionary. So it really set a new standard around texture that as the breeder post Scifresh and Scilate, we've all had to meet, and not only for New Zealand but also around the world. So that's great for consumers because they now have in Scifresh and Scilate the first examples of apples where the textures were not only, as I say, great after storage, a greater, if you like, eating window for those apples, but also every time consumers ate a apple of Scifresh or Scilate, they got a great experience. And that was quite interesting as well, that not just a good number of apples, it's like every apple, as long as it's well looked after, gives you that great eating textural experience that we all want in our apples today.
Yes, for sure. Many of my Northern Hemisphere friends and family love a Scifresh apple, although they know it as jazz, but they love those apples. And considering the consumer markets, actually, how much consumer research was sort of going on to sort of influence the traits that were being bred for back then?
I think that's an important part of assisted Alan in guiding the breeding strategy, particularly around when the selection was occurring, that because there had been some work published in the scientific literature around in the 1980s and into the 1990s, both New Zealand research as well as overseas, and also some work that Alan had been involved in himself with the consumer scientists up in Auckland, in Hawke research in those days, to show that texture was number one in terms of the way in which consumers valued apples. And so having that crisp, juicy texture was really important. I think Alan already knew that, but this really showed that it was number one in a big way, those textural traits.
Indeed. As the textural attributes are so important in the apple eating experience, then is that why we refer to Scifresh as Scifresh? Does it relate to the freshness of the eating experience? Is there an interesting story behind the naming of Scifresh and Scilate?
Well, I think it carries on. The first part of both cultivars is Sci, and that goes back to the historical naming of earlier varieties that were produced from DSIR, Department of Scientific Industrial Research, which were also started with a Sci. So this carries on the tradition of Sci. So that's the first part. And then, yes, fresh, the texture, but also that balanced acidity that we have in the cultivar that makes it as if it's freshly harvested off the tree. Of course, it's not as far as New Zealand exporters go. They're selling their fruit several months after harvest. But yeah, it's to do with the freshness. So you've got that one. And of course, with Scilate, it's a even simpler story. It's a late harvested apple in the month of April, which is the last month of the apple harvest for New Zealand. So late, Scilate.
So just briefly, for the people that are really deeply interested in genetics, we've mentioned that the Scifresh variety resulted from a cross between Braeburn mother and Royal Gala as the pollen donor or father, and the reciprocal cross produced Scilate. So what do we know about the direction of the cross and the importance for inheritance of traits in an apple? Is it a major consideration these days, or is there enough variation just from crossing two apple cultivars anyway?
No effect at all which way round the cross is. Unlike some other crops where it does have an effect, there is can be a maternal effect of the mother versus the father. But yeah, in this case, for apple, no difference. It boils down to logistics often as to which way round the cross is. Often, for instance, if you want to get a lot of pollen, you'll want to harvest that from the early flowering parent. So you have the pollen all ready to go to cross on to the mother, which is a later flowering one. So that might have been a consideration. But of course, nowadays you can also store pollen. So you can store the pollen, harvest the pollen one season, and then use it the following season. So I'm not sure what were the exact considerations that Alan used for the two crosses, but that would be one consideration he might have had.
Okay, cool. So we've talked a lot about the timeline that it takes in breeding in general, and probably it took a lot longer as well for Scifresh and Scilate, because of today we use many more technologies to speed the process up. And we have talked about the effort, the number of seedlings, the entire process is quite resource heavy. As if that wasn't enough, there's also a lot of effort going in from other science teams as well to support the ongoing success of these varieties. So tell us a bit about the support that the plant and food research scientists are giving to provide that ongoing success for Scifresh and Scilate, and of course all of the other cultivars that plant and food research creates.
Yeah, that's a really important part of the whole development process, is that while the breeder may be producing the cross and making the first selection or couple of selection phases from those crosses, the question that the post-harvest and the tree physiologists try to answer is, can that commercial potential be made real? Can growers actually grow a selection as a new variety that will make essentially a profit for them? Can the marketers of the new variety actually be able to sell the variety and make a decent return out of that for the owners of the variety and for the marketers of the variety? And then there's also the question of, are there any potential issues that need to be worked on to optimise the production and the post-harvest handling of that new variety? So there's quite a lot of work that has gone on, particularly in the last sort of like 10 years. So maybe 20 years ago it wasn't given so much emphasis, but now it's a really important part of any new variety development. I think it's around optimising growing and optimising the tree management of a new variety, optimising the post-harvest handling and storage. It's around optimisation. I think everyone's realised that you can take the new varieties that the breeders had first selected, take them through, but optimisation is about increasing efficiency and taking cost out of the system. And so by optimising, you're able to do that. And that's the role of these other research groups, is to do that.
Indeed. So it sounds like it's a very complicated process. When you think back about the whole chain as it is now, perhaps, what do you see are the main challenges, but also the highlights of the breeding process as you found it?
Well, I suppose the biggest challenge is always, and has always been, is time. You've highlighted it's complicated, but I think we've got well thought out processes that have been used for quite a few numbers of years, so we can get over the complication. I think we've got at Plant and Food, we've got a great resource in terms of germplasm. In other words, apple and pear varieties, both well developed and some less well developed, as a resource for us to use in our breeding. So we know we can produce good and improved cultivars, incorporating some of the new traits like disease and pest resistance, for instance, and so on. But it's the time it takes. And I think that's the biggest challenge that we still face. And I'm really excited about some of the new, and particularly some of the new genomic technologies that we've actually worked on for a little bit over time, but getting more funding to enable us to explore the potential of those technologies to improve the pace at which we can develop new cultivars. Not only that, but the use of new gene technologies that will enable, I call them tweaks to be made in genes to produce a new cultivar that is a step change from the original. And how do we incorporate that sort of gene editing technology into our traditional breeding to not only make things move faster, but also make changes that we maybe couldn't quite so easily make or predictably make with traditional breeding. That I look forward to those sorts of challenges being met by the people who've taken over from me in the next 5, 10, 15 years and so on. So I look forward to see how those things are going.
It's very exciting. So would it be fair to say that the highlight of the breeding process will be these technological advances that will address these challenges of time?
Yeah, that'll certainly be a highlight in the way in which they can be used to produce things that would either take a long time or might never been able to be produced through traditional breeding. But to see those changes actually in a new cultivar that's making an impact in the New Zealand apple industry and indeed maybe world industries, I think that's the big thing. You can make a change in a cultivar, but to actually have economic impact, that's the critical thing. It doesn't really matter whether you're been in the breeding game for 40 years, 20 years or 2 years. It's the impact that you make as a breeder on the communities and industry that you serve. That's the critical thing, by whatever technologies you've got available.
Indeed. And so reflecting back about the breeding process, in your opinion, what does make a great apple?
You probably see that from what we've been talking about, eating quality has to be number one. It has to be an eating apple that has, first and foremost, a great texture. And a great texture these days, they still needs to be juicy and crisp, but doesn't necessarily have to be hard. It can be a lighter texture. I quite like those sort of lighter style textures in an apple today. It has to have a flavour that is, for me, is distinctive and also differentiated. I like an apple that's something that's different to other apples that I have tasted, and I've tasted a fair number of apples in my time. So that's important. It has to look good, it has to be differentiated either by colour or by shape. But then it also be able to be grown well by, obviously, the growers, and has to store well. So I'm sort of being quite general, but it's around its eating quality for me has always been number one, as it was for Alan back, 30, 40 years ago when he selected Scifresh and Scilate. And what we're doing now is adding traits such as, disease and pest resistance, improving their productivity characteristics and so on.
So how does the collaboration between plant and food research and the commercialisation partners such as Turners and Growers Global and their variety management business, Venture Fruit, how does that create further innovation for the apple industry to meet the needs of consumers and producers?
Yeah, I think it's been a really great relationship from a breeding perspective because it enables the breeders to really feel as if they're in touch with the consumers. Turners and Growers and Venture Fruit are in the marketplace. They're connected to growers, to consumers with the current varieties that they are marketing. So they're able to come back to us with the most up-to-date information, consumer information possible on the way in which different consumers from all over the world perceive those varieties. And that can feed so much into our breeding objectives, our choice of parents and our selection strategies that we're making and fine-tuning all the time to produce the sort of apple varieties for the future that companies like Turners and Growers are wanting. So, yeah, it's just so invaluable, and we really value those sorts of connections that we've got.
Wonderful. So looking ahead, how do you see the success of Scifresh and Scilate and possibly other cultivars shaping the future of apple breeding in New Zealand? And what are you most excited about for the future of apple breeding in New Zealand?
Well, simply, I think Scifresh and Scilate represent success. There's nothing that beats success when it comes to, I suppose, the reputation of a breeding program, because the breeding program is reliant on resources, and we need to have resources for future apple breeding, and to show success is really important for that. And Scifresh and Scilate are real demonstrators of that success. I think it also shows the importance and demonstrates the importance of fruit quality and eating fruit quality, and all the traits that Alan all those years ago was selecting for around texture that we've been talking about, for instance, and taste, and all the other grower traits that are important. Just shows us that we need to carry on with that, and we can't replace that with anything else that we can add to it, but we can't replace those really important characteristics that we're breeding for. And I'm really excited about the new technologies that are coming along.
It's an exciting time to be in science, for sure.
Yeah.
So it's been a real pleasure speaking with you today, Richard. Thanks for being the spokesperson on the history of the success story of Scifresh and Scilate. And thanks for sharing your expertise on the key role of breeding in shaping New Zealand's primary industries. So thank you, Richard. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks very much, Hilary. It's been a real pleasure.
And thank you out there for listening. If you'd like to know more about the topics covered on Scigest, check out the episode pages on the Plant and Food Research website. Please also subscribe to or follow the Scigest channel and rate and review each episode. Thank you and mā te wā.